Okay, this is our second attempt on VC early stage financing lecture. We're going to keep this short and sweet. I appreciate everybody being patient as we go through this, but I think there's some interesting information in here for all of you budding entrepreneurs. So we'll start by skipping the bio, as you all had the chance to hear that already. And we'll jump right into some of the meat of the content. Before I get into this, I just want to outline here that something that Professor Cole says, and I want to echo, which is not all entrepreneurs need to or want to raise capital. Not all entrepreneurs are technology entrepreneurs. This lecture is really geared towards people who are interested in understanding more about the world of attracting investment for their businesses. I mentioned before in the live lecture that I'm an entrepreneur. I have a law firm. I'm not attracting capital for my business. It's not necessary for my business. And I'm not interested in the trade-offs of having kind of other stakeholders with my business. And I think fundamentally, as we go throughout this lecture and we think about how do I attract capital, and it's so appealing and romantic to go out and raise large sums of money, and that gives me all this kind of resources to attract talent and to market myself and get my product out into the world. That is all true, but you also have to realize that that comes at a cost, and the cost that it comes at is control, right? Nobody raises 10 or 20 or $50 million and doesn't give up control. It may not be that you give up a majority of the control, but those are other people who are at the table who have a voice, a legitimate voice, and you have to work with them. And that's part and parcel of raising money from institutional investors. And that's also part of the benefit of doing that. You just have to make sure that it's the right thing for your business and for your personality. So with that being said, here we have the entrepreneurs, investors, and specialists. These are really listed in descending order of importance, meaning entrepreneurs are the lifeblood that make the venture capital ecosystem work. Their innovation and their risk tolerance and their ability to go out and invent new things and bring products to people is really paramount. Investors, of course, are important because they provide the capital, and many investors also provide expertise in addition to their capital. They may have previously run businesses of their own, or they may have other portfolio companies that are in similar spaces or have dealt with similar problems, and they can be really helpful. And then specialists are, attorneys, accountants, bankers, etc. They are people who have really deep domain expertise in very specific areas. So just to make an example of it, I help people raise money. Meaning, once you have an investor who is interested in investing into your business and you have sort of a handshake deal, then you'll bring me in, or attorneys like me, and we'll help really kind of fully bake out that entire transaction, make sure you've thought through all the different angles, make sure that it's contractually sound, and that everybody understands what their rights and responsibilities and obligations are. And so, for the specialists, they play a very targeted role, but typically they might work with 50 or 60 or 100 different companies and play a very limited role for each of those, but have kind of deep domain expertise. So I think to start with, just thinking about what is the structure of your company. Here is kind of an example, a more graphical example of what we just talked about, but I want to kind of say in my experience with these relatively early stage startups, the CEO is really the kind of hub to the different spokes of the company. A lot of the specialists will coordinate with the CPO or somebody designated by the CPO. Of course, the entire operating company beneath the CEO really reports up to the CEO. And I want to talk a little bit about what happens above the CEO in the kind of corporate governance structure, because I think this is something people are a little bit less familiar with. I think intuitively people understand, if I'm an engineer on the engineering team, then I report to my manager, and my manager reports to the head of engineering, and the head of engineering reports to the CEO. That's something that we're, kind of understand more intuitively. The CEO is ultimately responsible to the board of directors. And the board of directors could be any number of individuals. Typically, it's anywhere from 1 to 5 individuals, depending on how large the company is, but typically it's 1 to 3 individuals. For sort of sub $100 million companies. So the directors might meet every other month, they might meet quarterly, but their idea is to listen to the CEO's strategic direction for the company, approve or push back on it jointly with the CEO, and the CEO is usually a director, him or herself as well, but jointly they will come up with the corporate strategy, and the CEO will be responsible for reporting periodically to the board of directors to let them know whether or not things are on track. The board members are appointed by the shareholders of the company. So in a very early stage company, you might have two co-founders who own the business 50-50. They're both on the board and one of them is the CEO. And it's really like the two people wearing three different hats in the company. But as the company becomes a little bit bigger and more robust, these roles become more distinguished. I think it's important that you think about these roles underneath the CEO: product, engineering, sales, marketing, ops, because for many of you, even those of you who want to be entrepreneurs, many of you will not start out as entrepreneurs. Many of you will go on to a larger company or a startup and gain skills as a member of a team and eventually start a company. And that's fine. In fact, I would say that's common. Most of the successful CEOs that I work with gain their skills in the service of somebody else's employment and kind of learned a market or gained a really valuable skill, expertise in a particular skill before they went on to found their own company. I'll just take a quick second to talk about some of the differences here, because you all will be going to some companies and you may be interested in understanding why I've differentiated some of these. Product and engineering are not the same thing. Product is product design. Fundamentally, your company is solving somebody's problem. That is the essence of what your company does. And it may be solving many problems, but usually startups are solving one specific problem to start out with. And the product team is primarily tasked with designing the solution to the problem. They will speak to the customers regularly. It will be important for them to understand which questions to ask and how to ask the right questions so that they can get the information they need to design the product that will be most satisfying to their clients. The engineering team is related to that, but different, which is the engineering team takes the designed product and makes it a reality. And typically, I think with venture capital and these startup companies, we think of technology or software specific companies, but you can do lots of different engineering. You could be making medical devices, you can be making shoes, you can be making hair products, you can be making beauty products, you can be making anything that's sold in the e-commerce setting. But somebody has to take the design and actually make it happen and exist in reality and make it usable. And there's a little bit of a back and forth and a complementary aspect here, because the product people are often very customer centric, really understand what the customers want, and are pushing the rest of the organization to really deliver a high quality customer experience. And then engineering team are often helping temper the expectations of the product people, helping them understand what the reality is, what the engineering solutions will allow. And those two components of the organization will push and pull each other. Will push and pull each other, and if they're working well together, they'll make each other better. Sales and marketing, not to belabor this, sales tends to be human capital. It tends to be individuals selling relatively high contract value things, whereas marketing tends to be people who are using tools and systems to advertise and gain sales kind of in a more electronic version. So, typical example here is, if I work for Palantir, and I'm in sales and marketing, I'm probably a salesperson, and I'm probably trying to get buyers of government contracts to, buy a $1 million per month subscription to some kind of data service, right? That's a very high touch, high EQ human interaction, getting those people to get through that process of making that purchase. Whereas, if I am a company that sells, $16.99 hand cream, meaning $16.99 hand cream, what I want is a team of marketers who know how to place Facebook and Google ads and drive traffic and do directed targeting so that I can, get my product in front of the right buyer and eventually kind of have them, check out my product and buy it. So two different functions. So here's a myth, right? Founders are college dropouts, and if you're an entrepreneur, then you have an entrepreneurial spirit and you just have to go start a business. That's not untrue, but in my experience, most of the successful entrepreneurs that I work with, they have spent years gaining an expertise in a specific skill, right? Maybe they're an expert product manager, maybe they're an expert engineer, maybe they're an expert salesperson or expert marketer or expert operational person. Usually they have some very concrete, tangible skill, and they're using that to gain credibility and gain insight to attract investment and to lead people within their organization. So, but this lecture is really about the fundraising process. So the fundraising process really has two kind of subcomponents. First, you have to sell the idea of your company before you sell your actual company. And here's what I mean is, when you are looking for investors, you're not going to start out talking about valuation and all this kinds of stuff. You're going to talk about the business. You need to get them to fall in love with your business, with your team, with your market, with the problem you're trying to solve and the solution that you're designing. That is the hook that you are setting. Fundamentally, fundraising is a sales process. You are selling a piece of your company to an investor. And so you have to tell the story. You have to create a narrative. You have to paint the picture of what it is that you're doing and why it's important for the investor to get on board with it. So in the early days, really, that's going to be talking about your team, the market, meaning like the problem that you're trying to solve, the size of the market, and you need to be able to show traction. It is a myth that people invest in ideas. Of course, it happens, but those days are gone. You must build something if you want somebody to invest in you. You must show the investors that you have identified a problem, that you have come up with a solution for the problem, and that you have assembled a team that is capable of building a minimum viable product, meaning something that can actually deliver a solution. And it really can be minimum viable. If your problem is you are trying to solve the frizzy hair woes of people like yourself, and your solution is that you have a natural avocado-based deep hair conditioner, and you make that conditioner in your kitchen sink using avocados that you buy at Costco, that is a minimum viable product. That is not going to scale. You're not going to build a company around that, but you've created a solution and you can get it out to a customer, and it's a minimum viable way. If you can do that, then you can attract more capital to build out a more scalable solution, and you can have manufacturing and packaging and shelf-stable products, and you can have all of the compliance and regulatory compliance and licenses that you need to sell people things. But in the early days, you just have to build a solution and show that you can build. Show that you can build something. And then you have to show traction, right? You have to show that people are actually buying the thing or using the thing that you're building. And if you can get some traction and build a minimum viable product, you can raise money. After you've kind of set the hook with the investor and you've described to them the problem and the solution and the team and why you're the right team and this is the right time and this market is a really interesting market and this is where we're going to start, but it can get much bigger than this and here's why. Next, you have to sell your company. You have to sell the valuation of your company. You have to decide, okay, I need X dollars and I'm willing to give Y% of my company. That in the early days is more art than science, right? For later stage companies that have revenue, there's all these different fancy metrics for how do you value a company, but really none of that exists in the early days with a minimum viable product and some core users. But it's actually pretty simple, even though it's not very scientific. It's really a kind of a simple supply and demand intersection. So for founders, you can think of it as, I want to raise X dollars. How much of my business would I be willing to give away for X dollars? And, as you go out and you talk to people and you get a sense of how interested people are in investing, that you'll triangulate in on what that percentage is. As just a general rule, most equity rounds, meaning when you're really raising money in the company at large scales, you're typically selling between 20 and 30% of the company at each equity round, 20 to 30% at each equity round, right? So that can give you a frame of reference. In the early stages, when it's kind of friends and family and smaller rounds, which we'll get into in a minute, which I talked about a little bit in the live lecture, those are smaller. Those are typically around 10% each. For the investors, it's a little bit different. For angel investors, they're really thinking about it like this. they usually have a target return in mind. So if they invest money, they might, depending on how risky the investment is and how much investing they do, they might be trying to get 10x returns on their money, or they might be trying to get 100x returns on their money. And so it's very easy for them to say, okay, you want me to give you $50,000. And I want to get a 10x return on my money, which means when it comes back to me, it has to be $500,000, right? So when you sell the business at my percentage ownership, how much would you have to sell the business for me to get $500,000 back? And you can pretty quickly triangulate in on a valuation for that, right? Because they're thinking, well, if you want me to invest today at a $10 million valuation, and I'm going to give you $50,000, well, I know what percentage of the company that will buy, right? It's just $50,000 divided by $10 million. It's actually $50,000 divided by 10 million, $50,000. It's called a post-money valuation. And that'll give you a percentage. And then you can say, okay, if I own that percentage, and assuming I take 20 to 30% dilution on each round and you raise another 2 or 3 rounds of financing, what will your valuation need to be in order for me to get 10x my money? And if it comes back and it turns out you need to be $1 billion company for them to get 10x their money, you better be tackling a really big market and a really hard problem. And it better be a solution that you can sell for a lot of money, because it's hard to build $1 billion company, right? They make headlines, but there's not a lot of $1 billion companies out there, right? But if you do that math and it turns out you need to sell your company for $100 million, well, that seems more achievable. And you might find angel investors are more interested. Funds are a little bit different. They're a little bit more sophisticated in how they do these things, but they basically have portfolio management rules, which say that typically their first check into a company, meaning when they invest in a company, it will be about 2% of their assets under management. So you can think they invest in 25 companies, they deploy 2% into each company, that's 50% of the fund. So they've deployed half of their capital, and then they're going to reserve the second half of their capital to double, triple, quadruple down on, say, their top 5, 6, 7 companies. So for funds, you can kind of figure out, okay, well, if they're going to write a check that's equal to 2% of their capital, then I know about what that check size is, right? Maybe they're writing $500,000 checks. And then usually these funds will also have a rule, which is they have to own somewhere between 10 and 20% of the business. It depends on the fund. They can be less than that. So now you can triangulate in, okay, well, if they have to write a $500,000 check and they have to own 10% of the business, I guess I know what my valuation range is. This is what we went through before. This is as you fundraise, there's different names to kind of classify what category you're in and how early in your development you are: pre-seed, seed 1, seed 2, series A, series B. I won't belabor this because we talked about this live in class, but I'll just hit these first bullet points I think are the most important, right? If you want to start a business and you want to go out and raise some initial money, putting friends and family aside, because friends and family, depending on how liquid they are, they may just invest in you because of you. But for most people, when you're trying to really attract investment, you have to first build your minimum viable product. And I've already talked about that in this video. You have to show people that you can build a solution, even if it doesn't scale, right? Paul Graham has this great essay called "Do Things That Don't Scale," right? Airbnb used to go around and take all the pictures of every house themselves. That's not scalable, but it's a minimum viable product, and you have to show what it can be. After you get your minimum viable product out the door and you've built something, you have to start to show traction, get some users, grow. That shows validation. You can raise some more money. As you've raised a little bit more money, the product becomes more sophisticated, right? You have a group of diehard users. You can raise more. I guess I still forgot to put the Series A slide in here, but the Series A slide is really the product market fit slide. Once you have product market fit, which is really just overwhelming demand for what your infrastructure can provide, you will go out and raise money. Typically, you'll raise $5 to $10 million at a Series A. Again, you're taking 20 to 30% dilution when you do that. And then for Series B, you're kind of becoming a market leader. You have sustained growth and you're attracting high-level executive talent, right? Typically not a CEO. Typically, the founders will still stay CEO, but you're hiring very experienced chief operating officers, very experienced chief financial officers if you're like in a fintech business. So there's, that's what we just talked about. When you fundraise, you're first selling the idea of your company, and then you're selling the valuation of your company. There's a lot of different terms, right? The legal terms for how you go through this. I don't think it's not actually critical right now. Eventually when you get to this point, like you'll have counsel and they can walk you through this. Fundamentally, the biggest question is how much of my business am I selling? You can't sell too much of your business too often, otherwise you won't be left with anything. But there are other things, and here's some different references that you guys can kind of Google and get more information on if you're interested. But these are other means of control that the investor exercises over the company beyond simply their percentage ownership, right? These companies are not a democracy where it's just like a majority vote rules. The investors get preferred stock, which has special bells and whistles, special privileges, and they do that in order to protect their investment. And it's an industry standard. So, you will expect to sell them stock that has superior rights than what you will hold as an individual founder. We talked about this a little bit in class. I'll give you 20 seconds on this, right? There's I think about really startup companies in 3 different categories: enterprise, life science, and consumer or e-commerce companies. They really have different capital needs, and here's kind of a breakdown. But enterprise companies are always building products, always making their product better, right? Like your product is your #1 sales and marketing strategy, having a great product. But you do have to invest in salespeople and sales teams with enterprise businesses, in my experience. Consumer and e-commerce company, it's really the same, except for instead of sales, you're investing in marketing. And we talked about the difference between those things. And for an e-commerce company, marketing can be 50% of your budget easily, right? Because you're just trying to push sales. And when you have a new product, people don't know about it, and you have to get out in front of people, right? And then the life sciences companies, these are like pharmaceutical developers, medical devices, things like that. They're usually very deep research based. These are usually founded by PhDs, grad students, like organic chemistry, kind of those types of folks. And there's a very kind of robust and niche market. Probably something you didn't know is most of the companies that go public every year are life science companies. It's just a very niche market and doesn't really grab a lot of headlines and consumer attention, but it's very capital intensive. And so they raise a lot of money, and they have to access the public markets quickly. A couple of additional resources for you guys. Something Ventured is a documentary that's on YouTube for free. It's just about the history of venture capital and how it started in Silicon Valley and kind of how Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. It was really interesting. It's actually kind of was one of the real chief events that kicked it off with like this banker, and I think he was in Boston, that really kind of came out here and helped set up what is now known as the venture capital industry. Paul Graham is like this kind of erudite investor, very well known in Silicon Valley and in the VC circles, and he has lots of essays. He's the founder of Y Combinator, if you're familiar with that incubator. But just a lot of interesting things. There are a lot of non-intuitive advice for people who want to start companies. This is like, Paul Graham is like the, like the spokesperson for startups in Silicon Valley. No more shameless plugs, but if anybody wants to contact me, if you're starting a company or whatever, you can go to my website, and then there's a way to contact me, and either myself or somebody on my team will get back to you. And you can look for me on LinkedIn and feel free to contact me. There's lots of helpful advice and free tools for people who are just starting out on their entrepreneurial journey. I wish you all the very best, and good luck.